$5,000. That's what Sloane Whitaker Reese decided another woman's dignity was worth, and she counted it out slow, bill by bill, so all 40 guests in the Voss mansion could hear the paper snap. It was February in Brookline, snow stacking up against the tall windows, and the woman she'd picked was standing against the wall, with a tray of empty champagne glasses, wearing a gray contractor's uniform a size too big for her. Her name was Mareva Aubriot Vance. She was 27 years old, and nobody in that ballroom knew one true thing about her. They didn't know she'd been awake since 5 that morning, or that she'd taken this shift because it paid $400, and $400 was exactly what she was short. They didn't know about the thin scar running up her left calf, hidden under her work slacks, or that on the 3rd of every month, she wired $89 to a funeral home in Dorchester and hadn't missed once in nearly 3 years. They didn't know she'd started losing the sound of her husband's voice in her head, and that it scared her worse than the debt did. All they saw was the help. "Come on," Sloane said, holding the money up the way you'd hold a treat over a dog. "Dance for us. Unless you're too embarrassed." Phones went up. Somebody laughed. The nervous kind that means nobody's going to stop this. Mareva set the tray down on the side table, and then she did something nobody saw coming. She bent, unlaced her rubber-soled work shoes, and stepped onto the black marble barefoot. She pressed her sole against the stone twice, testing it, the way a person does when they've stood on a stage before. Then she said, "I'll dance, but put your money away. I'm not taking it." Sloane's smile flickered. Because here's the thing about the man who owned that house. Augustin Voss was 34, and in Boston people said his name the way you'd say a diagnosis. His mother had cleaned other people's floors until it killed her. He'd watched it happen when he was 12, and he'd built everything he had on the back of that memory. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be in Antwerp. He wasn't supposed to walk through those front doors at the exact second the violin reached its last note. And when he did, snow still sitting on his shoulders, what he saw wasn't a woman he recognized. He'd never once seen her face in his life. What he recognized was something much smaller and much stranger, a single flick of a wrist he'd watched 4 times, 3 Octobers back, from the 3rd row. If you believe that how we treat the people who can do nothing for us is the whole measure of who we are, hit that like button. Share this with somebody who needs to hear it tonight. And subscribe so you don't miss a story like this one. Now let's go back to the beginning, to a small apartment in Roxbury at 3 in the morning, and meet the woman who was about to change everything in that room without ever raising her voice. The staircase in the Roxbury building had 19 steps, and Mareva, whom everyone here warmly called Mari, knew every single one of them, knew which ones creaked, which ones didn't, and exactly where to place her feet so she wouldn't wake anyone. She reached the 3rd floor a little before 3 o'clock in the morning, and she didn't go to her own apartment first. She walked to the door at the end of the hallway and knocked 3 times very softly, in the precise rhythm the 2 women had agreed upon long ago, without ever putting it into words. The door opened almost at once. Mrs. Nordqvist stood there in a thick gray sweater, her silver hair braided into a single plait that fell down her back, and she didn't ask a thing. She simply stepped aside to let Mari pass, and Mari entered a room so warm that the windows had fogged with condensation. Josiah lay asleep in the large armchair beside the fireplace, the blanket pulled up to his chin. He was still holding a pencil in one hand, his fingers loosely curled around it, as though he had drifted off in the middle of drawing a line and hadn't had time to let go. Ever since the accident that took Emery, the trauma had locked the boy's voice away, leaving him in a silent world where he only communicated through his drawings. Several sheets of paper rested on the table beside the chair, and on the top one was a bird with wings far too long for its body. Mrs. Nordqvist went into the kitchen and turned on the stove. The kettle began to murmur softly. She poured tea into 2 ceramic cups with chipped rims, set one in front of Mari, then sat across from her without saying anything. That was what Mari was most grateful for in this woman. She didn't ask how the day had gone. She didn't ask whether Mari was tired. She didn't ask the kind of questions whose honest answers would force them both to pretend. She only pushed the cup of tea toward her and left it there. Mari took a sip and felt the heat travel down into her chest, and for those 30 seconds she wasn't anyone at all. She wasn't the woman who scrubbed floors. She wasn't the woman who was short on rent. She wasn't the woman who still owed money. She was simply a woman drinking tea at 3 o'clock in the morning in the kitchen of someone kind. Then she set the cup down, reached into her coat pocket, pulled out several bills folded into quarters, and pushed them across the table. Mrs. Nordquist looked down, then pressed Mari's hand back toward her, not forcefully, but with finality. Mari opened her mouth to say something about how Mrs. Nordquist had watched him all evening, something about how this wasn't right, something about how she couldn't keep accepting so much. But Mrs. Nordquist spoke first. "My girl," she said, her voice still carrying the unmistakable music of a place very far away and very cold. "I've lived in this apartment for 11 years. 11 years, and no one ever knocked on my door. Now someone knocks every night. Who do you think is helping whom?" She lifted her cup and drank, and that was the end of the conversation. Mari put the money back into her pocket. She lifted Josiah into her arms. The boy didn't wake. He only wrapped his arms around her neck by instinct and breathed steadily against her shoulder, and the pencil slipped from his hand and landed on the carpet with the faintest sound. Mrs. Nordquist bent down, picked it up, placed it back on the table beside the drawings, then opened the door for the two of them. Mari's apartment was 7 steps away. It was small. The wooden floor had warped in 3 places, and the living room window needed a folded piece of paper wedged into the frame before it would close properly. But there wasn't a single speck of dust inside. Not one. Mari cleaned other people's homes for 12 hours a day, and she still came home and cleaned her own. Not because anyone made her, but because it was the only thing left in the world that was still within her control. She laid Josiah down on the bed, pulled the blanket over him, and stood watching him for a moment in the darkness. Then she went into the living room, sat on the edge of the chair, and took off her shoes. Her work shoes had rubber soles. She placed them side by side, the heels perfectly aligned, just as she always did. She pulled up the leg of her pants and looked at the scar running along her left calf. Thin and white, much fainter than it had been during the first year, but never entirely gone, and she didn't touch it. She only looked. On the wall across from her, where a wedding photograph should have hung, there was nothing. She had put the pictures away long ago, not because looking at them hurt, but because she was afraid that one day she would look at them and feel nothing at all. Somewhere in her mind lived the memory of a man who had once sat in a darkened theater, season after season, performance after performance, never missing a single night, and she had once believed that was something she could take for granted. Mari stood to go to bed. She walked across the quiet room with the measured, silent steps of someone whose body, no matter how long she stayed away, simply refused to forget. The laundromat on Blue Hill Street opened at 7 o'clock, and Mari was always there 15 minutes early, because dryer number 4 had to be kicked at the base before it would agree to turn, and she was the only one who knew exactly where to kick it. The work there was folding. Folding other people's shirts, folding other people's towels, folding the bedsheets of families she would never meet, while the smell of bleach mixed with fabric softener clung so deeply to her hair that she had stopped noticing it long ago. In the afternoon, she took off her apron, walked to the stop, and caught a bus across the city to a house in Brookline where people paid her to erase every trace that human beings had ever lived there. By day, she cleaned clothes. By night, she cleaned floors. Between those 2 jobs were 45 minutes on a bus, and those 45 minutes were the only time in the entire day when she was allowed to sit. On Thursday, she stayed after her morning shift and knocked on the manager's office door. His name was Dwight, and he wasn't a bad man. That was what made it harder. Had he been a bad man, she would have had somewhere to place her anger. He looked up from his screen, and she asked whether there was any way she could receive part of her next paycheck in advance. She asked very calmly and didn't explain why, because she had learned that reasons never helped. Reasons only made people uncomfortable. Dwight looked at her for 2 seconds. Then he said the company had stopped offering pay advances a long time ago, that everything now went through the system at the central office, and that there wasn't any button he could press. He said it in the voice of a man who had been forced to say the same thing many times and had grown tired of saying it. Then, more quietly, he added that he was sorry. Mari nodded. She thanked him for his time. She meant it without sarcasm, because he had given her his time. Then she turned away and closed the door very gently behind her. On the bus, she sat in the row just behind the front wheel, where the ride was least rough, and opened her phone. She had a banking app and a notes app, and she began doing the thing she did every week, the thing no one ever saw, the thing that consumed more of her life than scrubbing floors ever did. She calculated. She looked at the number in her account, then at the rent date, then at the third of the month approaching like something that couldn't be negotiated with. She tried pushing the electric bill back by 1 week. It wasn't enough. She tried giving up her monthly bus pass and buying individual fares instead. That brought her close. But individual fares cost more in the long run, and she had learned that poor people were always charged extra for the very fact that they were poor. She looked at the amount deducted directly from her paycheck every 2 weeks, the money she had no right to touch, the money they took before it ever reached her hands, and she sat with it for a while the way people sit beside the weather. Then she looked at the final line, her physical therapy appointment, once a month, at a small clinic near the hospital, where a man showed her how to stretch whatever had been damaged inside her left calf so it would protest a little less. It was the only thing in her budget whose sole purpose was her. Not rent, not electricity, not the third of the month, not pencils and drawing paper. Just her. She had held on to it for 2 years, and many times she had nearly given it up, and each time she had told herself that if she gave up this, what would be left? The bus stopped at a red light on the avenue. Mari opened the clinic's app. She found next month's appointment. She tapped it. At the bottom was a gray button that said cancel appointment, and beneath it, in smaller letters, was a question asking whether she was sure. She pressed yes. The screen changed to a confirmation page and thanked her for giving advance notice. She closed the app. She turned off the screen. She slipped the phone into her coat pocket and looked out through the window, where dirty snow had gathered in ridges along the curb, and the light turned green and the bus moved on. She didn't cry. Nothing on her face changed at all. The woman sitting beside her kept reading something on her phone, never realizing that the person next to her had just cut away the final piece of herself. And that was the thing no one ever told you about poverty. It didn't arrive like a punch. It came as a series of very small calculations, day after day, until you looked down and realized you had been cutting yourself away piece by piece, and you couldn't even remember what the first piece had been. The building's mailboxes were on the ground floor, a row of dented metal compartments, and Mari's was the fourth from the left, its lock so loose that she could open it with a hard pull. She collected the mail on evenings when she came home early, and that night there was one envelope she recognized before she even read the words on it, because she had received enough of them to know it by touch. The paper was thicker than ordinary mail. A plastic window sat in the upper left corner. The stamp on the right was slanted, printed in a typeface designed to look like a court without actually being one. Inside was a single page from a company called Crescent Recovery Group, and the page said the same things the one before it had said, and the one before that had said too, except for the number at the bottom, and the number at the bottom went down so slowly that, if she looked at it 1 month at a time, it barely seemed to move at all. Mari didn't open it in the hallway. She carried it upstairs, placed it on the kitchen table, and opened it only after she had taken off her coat, because she had learned that if she let things like this interrupt the sequence of her movements, the whole evening would be ruined. She read it, then she folded it, and placed it in the stack of papers in the second drawer, where the earlier letters were kept, and that drawer was harder to close than it had been the year before. There were 2 debts in Mari's life, and she thought about them in completely different ways. The first was the hospital debt. It was enormous. It wasn't hers in any sense she could bring herself to accept, because it was the bill for a night she hadn't chosen, a night that began with a husband and wife going to the movies and ended with one of them never coming home. The hospital had saved her. She was grateful for that in the way people are grateful for something they never asked for. Then the hospital sold the debt, sold her along with it, sold her to a name printed on an envelope, and after that it was no longer a sum of money but a living creature, something with teeth, something that reached between her and her paycheck every 2 weeks, and took its share first, before the number ever touched her account, before she even had the chance to see it. She had no right to negotiate with it. She had no right to delay it. She had no right to tell it that Josiah needed drawing paper that month. It took and it didn't ask, and every time she saw that deduction on her pay stub, what rose in her throat wasn't sorrow but a cold anger, the kind of anger that had nowhere to go, and so remained where it was. She hated that debt with a clean and tireless hatred. The second debt was different. The second was $89 every month, sent to a funeral home in Dorchester. No one forced her to pay it. No one deducted it from her wages. No envelopes arrived, no one called, and if she stopped sending it, nothing would happen at all. Not one thing. The world wouldn't move a single millimeter. They had allowed her to pay in installments, because she had nothing in her hands that week, and the man at the funeral home had sat across from her and said in a very gentle voice that many families did the same, that it was all right, and she had signed the paper without even reading it. Some people made payments on cars. Mari made payments on the wooden box where her husband lay, and on the 3rd of every month, no matter what was in her account, no matter what she had been forced to cut away that week, she opened her phone and sent $89, and she did it before she paid the electric bill. Because the first debt was something people took from her. The second was the only thing she was still allowed to give. She hated the first. She would die before abandoning the second. As for the car, no one had ever been named. The report said the driver was unidentified, that the vehicle had been abandoned several blocks from the scene, that the license plate didn't belong to it. The police called her exactly twice during the first year. After that, they stopped calling, and she understood that there were questions in this city that weren't allowed to have answers. She had stopped asking, not because she had forgiven anyone, but because when you keep knocking on a closed door, eventually you're the one who wears away. The only thing she had managed to keep of Emery was 3 voice messages. In one, he had called from school during a break just to ask what she wanted for dinner. In another, he had called while driving, with music playing very softly in the background. In the third, he had called and said nothing for the first 3 seconds because he was laughing at something on the other end, and she had never found out what it was. She listened to them every night during the first year, then less often. Then the phone died one summer morning, without warning, without reason. She took it to 3 different repair shops, and the last person, a young man who seemed genuinely sorry, told her the circuit board was gone, that nothing could be recovered, that he was sorry. And now, when Mari tried to hear Emery's voice inside her head, she could still remember his face, remember the smell of his shirt, remember the way his fingers tapped against the steering wheel in time with the music. But his voice had begun to fade around the edges, like a photograph left in the sun for too long. And she was afraid, she was terribly afraid of the day when she would no longer be able to hear it at all. The house in Brookline had no number on the gate. A place where everyone with business there already knew the way didn't need one. It stood far back from the street behind a row of old elm trees, and from the outside it looked like nothing more than a silent mass of gray stone, the kind of wealth that didn't want to be seen. Inside, the floors were black marble, so black that during the day they cast a cold light onto the ceiling, and it had taken Mari nearly a month to learn how to clean them. Black marble was the enemy of anyone who cleaned houses. It remembered everything, a footprint, a drop of water, the streak of a cloth drawn in the wrong direction, and it held on to each one, exposing it beneath the lights for everyone to see. She had learned that she had to work backward, that she had to divide the floor into strips, and never step on the section she had just finished, that she had to end at the doorway rather than in the middle of the room. The house had 22 rooms, and most of them were empty. Not empty in the sense that they held no furniture, but empty in the sense that no one ever entered them. The curtains remained drawn, the air stood still, and the dust in those rooms settled according to a rhythm of its own, the dust of places where time had nothing left to do. At the end of the west corridor was a room that contained nothing but a grand piano, a Bosendorfer made of dark wood, its lid closed. There was no bench, there was no music on the stand. Mari dusted it every Tuesday evening, and she did that task more quickly than anything else in the house, and she had never lifted the lid, and no one had ever told her not to. The housekeeper's name was Ottilie Brannigan. She was past 60 Irish, and she moved through that house with the manner of someone who knew exactly where everything belonged, and saw no reason to comment on any of it. She wasn't friendly. She wasn't cold either. She was simply fair, and in Mari's world, fairness had become so rare that it almost felt like tenderness. On Mari's first evening there, when the Bright Path crew stood in a line along the service corridor to hear the rules, Mrs. Ottilie walked down the row and looked at each person in turn, and when she reached Mari, she stopped. She didn't say anything. She only looked, and the look lasted exactly 1 second longer than it should have. Long enough for Mari to feel it, long enough for her to raise her eyes, and by the time she did, Mrs. Audley had already turned away and was explaining that hot water mustn't be used on Walnut. It was never mentioned again. Bright Path's presence in the house was new. The Voss household had once employed its own domestic staff, people who had worked there for years, some of them since before Augustin Voss bought the place, and they knew the house in the way outsiders never could. Then Sloane Whittaker Rees moved in. Within a month, every one of them was gone. Sloane called it modernization. She told guests that no one kept permanent household staff anymore, that outsourcing was more flexible, cleaner, and she said it in the kind of voice that made anyone who disagreed feel as though they were the one who had fallen behind. What she didn't say was that Bright Path belonged to the husband of one of her friends, and that from every invoice the house paid them, a very small, very tidy portion found its way back. Renz Kovac had objected. He objected in his own way, which meant he didn't raise his voice. He simply stood in the office at the harbor and laid out the facts in their proper order. 8 strangers, 3 times a week, moving in and out of a house containing rooms where strangers weren't permitted. And not one of those 8 people had been screened by the organization. He said it wasn't a matter of cleaning. He said it was an open door. Augustin Voss was standing at the window at the time, looking down over the docks, his phone pinned between his shoulder and his ear, as he listened to a man on the other end talk about a shipment being held, and he listened to Renz with only half the attention he possessed. There comes a season in the life of every man who has too much to protect. A season when he begins choosing what not to look at. He didn't argue. He didn't ask who Bright Path was. He only said 3 words without turning around, without taking his eyes from the cranes beyond the glass, as they moved slowly through the fog. Just let her. Renz stood there a moment longer, then nodded and walked out, and the door closed behind him. 3 words. They took less than a second to say. And on the other side of the city, a woman whose name Augustin Voss had never heard was folding strangers' clothes, never knowing that a door had just opened for her. Sloane Whittaker Rees was beautiful, in the way something preserved was beautiful. Her platinum blonde hair was cut in a blunt line, sharp as a ruler's edge. Her skin held at the same unchanging shade of white through every season, and around her neck she always wore her grandmother's pearls, the only thing in the house that hadn't yet been sold. People looked at her and thought of expensive objects displayed behind glass, dusted, polished, and turned to the proper angle every week. Things that were beautiful because someone paid for them to remain beautiful. She had 2 voices. One was for guests, soft, warm, slightly low, the kind of voice that made the person across from her feel as though they had just been chosen. The other was the voice she used after the door had closed, and it wasn't louder or harsher. It was simply empty, as though someone had drawn all the warmth out of the very same words. The household staff heard only the second voice. With Mari. It began one evening in January, in the small sitting room in the East Wing, where there was a Persian rug Mrs. Audley had warned the entire cleaning crew mustn't be touched by anything wet. Mari was wiping down the window frame. Sloane entered with a glass of red wine in her hand, stopped in the middle of the room, and said nothing for a while. Then she looked directly at Mari, held her gaze, and opened her fingers. The glass fell. It didn't break. It bounced once against the thick wool and rolled away, while the wine spread into a shape that was almost a perfect circle, dark and widening, slowly working its way down into the fibers. "Oh," Sloane said. "I suppose I'm clumsy." Mari set her cloth on the windowsill. She went to fetch cold water, white towels, and a box of salt from the kitchen, moving neither quickly nor slowly, and when she returned, Sloane was still standing in exactly the same place. Mari knelt. She didn't scrub. Scrubbing was how people ruined a rug. She blotted, pressed, lifted, blotted again, shifted to a clean section of cloth, then repeated the process and repeated it again. And each time the dark ring faded a little more. It took nearly half an hour. During that entire half hour, Sloane didn't go anywhere. She didn't sit down. She didn't take out her phone. She stood with her arms folded across her chest, looking down at the crown of the woman kneeling on her floor and waiting for something. She waited for a sigh, a tightening of the jaw, a sideways glance, anything at all. Mari gave her nothing. When she was finished, she gathered the stained towels, rose to her feet, said the area needed to dry naturally, and asked that no one step on it for the next few hours, then left the room. Sloane remained there alone with the rug almost clean, and for those 3 brief seconds, something appeared on her face that no one saw, something that looked very much like the confusion of a person who had reached out to strike and missed. Renskovich had been standing in the hallway doorway from the beginning. He had come to wait for a signature on a document from the harbor, and he had seen everything, from the moment Sloane's fingers opened to the moment Mari walked away. He didn't enter, he didn't speak. He belonged to an organization whose first rule was knowing one's place, and that woman was about to become his employer's wife, while the woman kneeling on the floor was nothing more than a name on the roster of a cleaning company. He stood there until the hallway was empty, then went out to his car. But he didn't forget. Some people forget everything, and some people forget nothing, and Renz belonged to the second kind, and what he placed in that quiet chamber of his mind would remain there for a very long time before it demanded repayment. What no one in that house knew, not Mrs. Ottilie, not Renz, not even the man who was about to marry her, was that Sloane Whitaker Reese was drowning. Her family trust, the name once spoken aloud in every boardroom in Boston, had been hollowed out years before. The shell was still standing. The house on Beacon Hill was still standing, though it had been mortgaged twice. The pearls were still there. But inside, nothing remained, and every morning she woke with the feeling of a person walking across ice and hearing a crack somewhere beneath her feet without being able to tell where it had come from. This marriage was her final life raft. Not a good marriage, not love, not anything at all except a life raft. And a person clinging to a life raft didn't look around for someone to love. That person looked around to see whether anyone else was floating higher. That was why she hated Mari, though she would never have been able to put it into words. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't envy. It was because there was a woman kneeling on her floor who had nothing left to lose, and who still stood straighter than she did, and Sloane couldn't bear it. The room in Antwerp stood above a warehouse, and inside it there was nothing but a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a lamp hanging too low. Wendell Krajic sat on one side of the table with both hands resting open upon the wood, and Augustin Voss sat across from him, his coat still on. The 2 men said nothing for a long time. Wendell was the man who had carried Augustin around the backyard before he had learned to walk. Wendell had been one of the 4 men who carried his mother's coffin that February, and Augustin could still remember which corner he had stood at. And Wendell was the man who, during the previous autumn, had sat in an unmarked car in a supermarket parking lot and spoken with 2 federal agents for more than an hour. There was nothing to argue about. The documents lay on the table between them, and neither man touched them. "What are you going to do to me?" Wendell finally asked. His voice didn't tremble. He had lived long enough in this world to know that when the time came, a man sat with his back straight. Augustin didn't answer at once. He took an envelope from the inside pocket of his coat and pushed it across the table. Inside was a plane ticket to Lisbon, a name that wasn't Wendell's, and enough money for a man his age to live out the rest of his life without ever having to work again. Wendell stared down at it for a long time. Then he understood, and his face began to collapse. "You'll live," Augustin said. "You'll have money. You'll have a new name, and no one will come looking for you. And you'll never see your daughter again. Not one phone call. Not one letter. Not one time standing across the street and looking through the window of her home." Wendell opened his mouth. He called Augustin's name the way a person calls to a child he once carried in his arms. He began to say something about why he had done it, and perhaps the reason was true, perhaps it deserved to be heard. Augustin didn't let him finish. "You already chose, Wendell," he said very softly. "I'm only giving you exactly what you chose." Then he stood, fastened one button of his coat, and walked toward the door. Wendell didn't call after him. That was the worst part. Had he called after him, perhaps it would have been easier. On the flight back to Boston, Augustin turned off the reading light and sat in the darkness. Beneath him lay the Atlantic, black and empty. He had seized control of the organization at 26, taken it from the half-brother their father had acknowledged, the son who bore the family name legally while Augustin carried it only because a stubborn woman had written it on his birth certificate. It had taken him 8 years to make that name mean something. And now, in the darkness at an altitude of 10,000 meters, he thought of a man sitting in a room beneath a lamp that hung too low, holding an envelope filled with money, and knowing he would never see his daughter's face again. He hadn't killed anyone. He had told himself that many times. But one question kept rising in his mind throughout the entire flight, and he had no answer for it, and he still had no answer when the plane's wheels touched down in Boston. Had he become his father? The message from Bright Path arrived on Wednesday afternoon, and it was so brief that Mari had to read it twice. Special Friday evening shift at the Brookline address, private party, additional staff needed, double pay. At the bottom of the message was the number. $400 for one night. Mari stood in the middle of the laundromat with the phone in her hand, and inside her mind the number immediately broke itself into pieces and flew toward their appointed places. This part for rent, that part for something else, and she didn't need to calculate. She already had. She had been calculating for weeks. She replied with one word, yes. That evening, she came home earlier than usual, and Josiah was sitting on the living room floor with sheets of paper spread around him in an uneven circle. And when she opened the door, the boy looked up, and his entire face lit with the kind of joy only children could give, the kind that held nothing back. She sat down on the floor beside him and removed her scarf. Josiah was Emery's younger brother. When Emery was gone, Mari was the one who remained. That was all this story needed you to know. The boy handed her a sheet of paper with a whale wearing a hat, and Mari studied it with complete seriousness, then asked whether the hat belonged to the whale or whether it had borrowed it from someone. Josiah thought for a moment, then shook his head, then nodded, then laughed. The boy communicated through drawings. People had explained it to Mari using long words, and she had learned that the best thing wasn't to ask him to speak, but to sit down, look at the paper, and ask the right question about it. She told him that the following night she would be working late, at a large party with many people. She told him he would stay with Mrs. Nordqvist as usual. Then she said that the next morning, when he woke, there would be cake, the kind with almonds on top. Josiah looked at her, and she nodded, and the boy threw both hands into the air, then fell backward onto the floor in the middle of all the paper, as though the news were too large to receive while sitting upright. Mari laughed. She didn't laugh often. She stood and went to change her clothes, and when she returned, Josiah was bent very close over a fresh sheet of paper, shielding it with one hand, and he waved her away when she tried to peek. She went to cook noodles. From the next room, she heard the sound of pencil moving across paper, and that sound was one of only 3 or 4 things left in the world that could still make her chest loosen. By the time the noodles were ready, the boy was standing in the kitchen doorway, holding the drawing with both hands, and he offered it to her. Mari wiped her hands on her apron and took it. On the paper was a woman. She stood on one leg, the other was bent behind her. Both arms were raised high above her head, and the artist had tried with all his strength to make the fingers meet at the top, while her hair streamed to one side as though there were wind inside the room. Around her were yellow dots, so many of them that they covered the entire page. Mari looked at it. "Who is this?" she asked, and her voice sounded normal, because she was careful to make it sound normal. Josiah pointed at her. Then he pointed at the drawing. Then the boy lifted both hands above his head and rose onto his toes, swaying slightly, and burst into laughter when he nearly fell. Mari stood there in the small kitchen with the paper in her hands. The boy had never seen her dance. He had never seen anyone dance. He was only a child who had lived beside her for 2 years and didn't understand why his sister-in-law walked the way she did. And one day he had sat down on the floor and imagined the rest for himself. She told him the picture was beautiful. She thanked him. Then she spooned the noodles into bowls, and the two of them ate at the kitchen table, while Josiah told the story of the whale by drawing 2 more pages as he waited for his noodles to cool. On Friday evening, when Mari put on her gray uniform and prepared to leave, she paused for 1 second beside the kitchen table. The drawing was still there. She picked it up, folded it in half, then folded it into quarters, and slipped it into the breast pocket of her uniform. She didn't ask herself why she had done it. People didn't always know why they carried something with them. Then she turned off the light and walked to the bus stop. The house had never looked like that before. Sloane had ordered every electric bulb removed from the ballroom and replaced with candles, hundreds of candles set in glass holders along the walls and across every available surface, and their light transformed the black marble floor into a motionless lake, throwing everything back onto the ceiling in distorted, shifting shapes. In the northern corner of the room sat a real string quartet, 4 musicians dressed in black on 4 chairs, brought in solely for that purpose. And they had been playing since 7 o'clock, playing without pause, playing the kind of music no one truly listened to. Yet if it stopped, the entire room would immediately become uncomfortable. Champagne was opened in the adjoining room and carried out on silver trays, and those trays mustn't remain empty for more than 30 seconds. That was the rule, and Mrs. Audley had repeated it to the staff twice. 40 guests. Exactly 40, because Sloane had counted and recounted the list for 2 weeks, and every name on it was a decision, while several names had been crossed out at the last moment for reasons known only to her. There were Augustine's business associates, men and women who came because they had to. There were old Beacon Hill families who came out of curiosity. There were a few younger, sharper faces, people who photographed everything and made their living by photographing everything. And there was Corbin Halloway, the owner of an auction house in the South End, who had come for reasons of his own. Sloane wore silver. The gown reached the floor and caught the candlelight with every movement, and she had tried it on 7 times before the mirror over the course of 3 days. The party had consumed an amount of money so large that saying it aloud would have sounded like a joke, and not 1 cent of it belonged to her. It was Augustin Voss's money, charged to Augustin Voss's card, for an evening whose only purpose, its real purpose, the purpose beneath every candle and every glass of champagne, was to stand in the middle of that room and tell the whole city of Boston that the Whittaker name was still alive. She moved through the crowd and did what she did best. She touched people's arms in exactly the right place. She remembered their children's names. She laughed at precisely the right moment, and she allowed each person's conversation to drift naturally toward the wedding. And whenever someone asked for the date, she spoke the number aloud and listened to it hang in the air like something that had already been sealed. A little after 8 o'clock, her phone vibrated. She glanced down while still nodding at a man, speaking about real estate in the seaport. The message was brief. Sorry, coming home late. Nothing else. No explanation, no time, not a single word she could use. Sloane read it, and her fingers tightened around the phone until her knuckles turned white. Then she looked up and continued nodding at the man, while inside her mind the entire room had changed shape. 40 people were standing in this house to witness an engagement, and the other half of that engagement was somewhere across the ocean and didn't consider it necessary to explain why. People would notice. People always noticed. She turned away from the man and walked toward the champagne table, and on the way she passed 2 women standing beside a stone column, and one of them was speaking quietly, though not quietly enough. The Whittaker Trust could do that once, yes, but that was a long time ago. That was all. Their conversation had already moved on to something else before Sloane had passed the full length of it. No one looked at her. No one knew she had heard. But she had heard the tense of the verb, and that tense was a door closing. She reached the table and took a glass. Then she took another. Candles burned, the strings played, people laughed, and in the middle of it all stood a woman in a silver gown, holding herself perfectly straight and beginning to need something, right now, that very night. Something that would show every one of them that she still held power in this house. And her eyes began moving around the room. No one in that room knew what happened inside Mari's mind between the moment she heard the question and the moment she opened her mouth to answer. It lasted less than 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, she thought about money. That was the first thing. Not dignity, not Emery, not Sloane. Money, her mind, the mind that had been trained for nearly 3 years to do one thing and one thing only, did it at once without asking permission. It took that number and began dividing it. How many appointments at the clinic for Josiah? How many weeks she wouldn't have to watch the 3rd of the month coming toward her like an oncoming car? How long she would be allowed to breathe? It finished the calculation before she could stop it, and when it was finished, she knew the answer, and the answer was yes, it was worth it. And that was the precise moment something inside her chest broke open. Not because the other woman had humiliated her in front of 40 people. Mari had been humiliated before. A person could live with that. A person could kneel to clean a stain of spilled wine, rise again, and still remain whole. What broke her was the discovery that Sloane had been right. That was exactly what the woman had just told the entire room, that there were people in this world who would do anything if someone simply held up enough money, and Mari had just proven it true inside her own mind, in 4 seconds. She had once been someone else. She had once stood beneath the lights, with 1,000 people seated in the darkness, and she had given them something no one could buy, and now that thing, the only part of her former self that remained, the thing she had hidden away and refused to touch for 3 years because it was too sacred to bring into the open, had just been assigned a price inside her mind, and she had found that price worth paying. No one had taken it from her. She had nearly sold it herself. That was the worst thing that had ever happened to her in that house, and it happened inside her own skull, and not one of those 40 people saw a thing. At the back of the crowd, Mrs. Ottilie Brannigan stepped forward, only one step. She had been standing at the entrance to the service room with her hands clasped in front of her apron, and she had heard everything, and that step belonged to a woman past 60 who was preparing to do something that would almost certainly cost her job. Sloane didn't turn her head. She only shifted her eyes, a glance that lasted less than half a second, and that glance crossed the room, touched Mrs. Ottilie, and told her one thing, that she knew exactly who she was in this house. Mrs. Ottilie stopped. Her hands tightened together against her apron until her knuckles turned white. She didn't step back. She didn't step forward either. She simply stood there, and there was something in her eyes that Sloane would have feared had she looked for longer than half a second. At the edge of the crowd, Corbin Holloway raised his phone. He didn't hold it high like the others. He kept it level with his chest, discreetly, with both hands, in the posture of a man who had done this before and knew which angle was best. He had begun recording before the music had even been chosen. Then, with his thumb and without taking his eyes from the screen, he typed a brief message and sent it. No one noticed. Everyone was looking toward the center of the room, and in the center of the room, the woman in the gray uniform, one size too large, had just made a decision, and she had made it not with the mind that had spent 3 years calculating, but with something deeper, something that had been sleeping for a very long time, and had just opened its eyes. If she danced for the money, the other woman won. If she walked away, the other woman won too. There was only one door left, and it was narrow, and it was costly, and Mari stepped through it. Sloane turned toward the quartet. She had already planned this, had planned it while Mari was setting down the tray, and what she wanted wasn't a cheerful piece of music. Cheerful music forgave people. Cheerful music moved quickly, and when something moved quickly enough, a person could hide inside it, could sway, could laugh off the awkwardness, could turn clumsiness into a joke and escape. She didn't want Mari to escape. She walked over to the first violinist, bent down, and spoke the name of a piece. The musician looked up at her for 1 second, the look of a man who understood exactly what he had just been asked to do. Then he nodded and turned to speak to the other 3. Slowly, Sloane said, loudly enough for the room to hear, as slowly as you can play it. So we can all see clearly. Mari heard the name, and she stood still for 3 seconds. No one understood those 3 seconds. From the outside, it looked only like a woman gathering her courage, and perhaps a few people in the crowd even felt pleased because they thought she was afraid. But what happened inside her was this. One autumn, a long time ago, in a small apartment that no longer belonged to her, there had been a man who sat at an old piano every evening and practiced that exact piece. He wasn't good. He taught music at a school, and he knew he wasn't good. And still he practiced night after night because he wanted to play it for her on her birthday. And he wanted to play it properly. She had heard it drifting through the kitchen wall while she washed dishes. She had heard it while she dozed in the chair. And always, there was one place in the middle where he stumbled. The same place. Every single time. He would curse under his breath and go back to the beginning of the measure, and she would call from the kitchen that it was that same place again, and he would shout back for her to be quiet, and they would both laugh. She had teased him about that place on the final night she still had him. He had never managed to play the piece all the way through. Mari opened her eyes. She looked toward the door, only once, very quickly, toward the 2 large closed doors at the far end of the room. Then she turned back. No one noticed. She stepped into the center. The marble was cold beneath the soles of her feet, so cold that it bit, and she stood still for 1 second to let her skin grow accustomed to it, because she knew that if it didn't, her first step would fail. Then she did something that 40 people saw, and not one of them understood. She pressed the sole of her foot into the stone, shifted it slightly outward, then pressed again. She was searching for the slick spot. Every floor had one, and a person had to know where it was before trusting it with the weight of her body. Behind her, the first violinist raised his instrument. There was a silence longer than necessary, the kind of silence made by four musicians waiting for one another. And within that silence Mari stood alone in the middle of the black floor beneath the candlelight, her arms resting at her sides. Then the first note came. It didn't arrive like a sound. It came like something being drawn out of the air, long, solitary, so thin that it seemed ready to break, and it fell into the room, and the room went completely still. Mari heard the first note, the second, the third, and on the fourth, her body began to remember without asking her permission. Her shoulders lowered. She didn't lower them. They lowered on their own, slipping free from the posture that 3 years of carrying trays and bending over floors had forced them into, and returning to the exact place someone had taught her to hold them when she was very young. Her chin lifted. Not high, just enough. Her spine lengthened from her pelvis to the crown of her head as though someone above her had taken hold of a thread and gently drawn it upward. And suddenly the gray uniform that was one size too large no longer hung from her body, but rested upon a form occupying space in an entirely different way. And her breathing changed. That was the thing only those who knew would recognize. Ordinary people breathed into their chests. Those who had been trained breathed lower, slowly, deeply, in perfect rhythm, and that rhythm didn't belong to the body but to the music. And Mari found it from the very first note, as though the past 3 years had been nothing more than a rest between two shoes. Her right arm left her side and opened outward. That was all that happened in the first measure, one arm traveling from one place to another, and it took nearly 4 seconds to complete the distance. There was nothing to laugh at, nothing at all. It was only an arm unfolding so slowly that people could see each joint yielding to the next, and when her fingers reached the end of their path, they didn't stop but continued to reach a little farther, into a space no one in that room had known existed, and it was that final fraction of an inch that killed the laughter. It didn't die all at once. That was the strangest part. It went out one person at a time, like lights extinguishing along a long corridor. The man standing near the quartet fell silent first, then the 2 women beside the stone column, then the group by the champagne table, the loudest group of all, and they quieted more slowly because they were in the middle of a story, and that story grew softer and softer until it dropped away and no one picked it up again. Before half the piece had passed, the only sounds left in the room were the 4 instruments and the faint burning of the candles. Mari turned. She didn't turn quickly. She wasn't allowed to turn quickly with this music, and a slow turn was 10 times harder than a fast one, because there was no centrifugal force to support her, only herself and gravity and the axis she had to build within her own body. She stopped exactly where she had begun, not a single centimeter off. Then she leaned backward, her throat exposed, one arm sweeping through the air as though searching for something and failing to find it, and somewhere behind the crowd, someone released a very quiet breath. Sloane stood with her arms folded across her chest. She couldn't remember when she had folded them, and now, without any command from her mind, those arms slipped down to her sides. She looked around. It was the instinct of someone who had suddenly realized she was standing alone. She searched for a pair of eyes, any pair of eyes, someone who would look back at her and raise an eyebrow with her, curl the corner of a mouth with her, someone who would confirm that what was happening was ridiculous. There was no one, not one person. 40 heads were turned in the same direction, and not one of them was turned toward her. And in that moment, Sloane Whitaker Reese understood something it would take her years to put into words. She had built a stage. She had invited 40 people. She had cleared the center of the room, arranged the lighting, hired the musicians, and then she had handed all of it to the woman she had intended to destroy. In the corner of the room, near the entrance to the service area, Mrs. Audley Brannigan was crying. She made no sound. She stood as straight as she always did, her hands still clasped in front of her apron, while tears ran down both sides of her face and she didn't wipe them away. No one was looking at her. Had anyone looked, they would assume she was moved, because the dance was beautiful. And what none of those 40 people knew, what that magnificent room couldn't possibly imagine, was that Mari was in pain. Every time she placed her weight on her left leg, something traveled from her heel into her calf. And it wasn't a sharp pain, but the worse kind, the burning kind, the kind that told you it wouldn't stop and would still be there tomorrow. She hadn't danced an entire piece in 3 years. Her body remembered everything except how to endure it. But she didn't stop. There wasn't a cry, not a grimace, not a single lost beat. The only thing that betrayed her was one drop of sweat running down her temple in the middle of February, inside a room surrounded by winter. And at one point, only one, she closed her eyes for one beat longer than necessary. Then the music began to descend. Everyone knows when a piece of music is ending, even those who have never heard it before. Mari lifted her entire body one final time, her arms beginning to rise, and before her left wrist opened, it tilted slightly inward, only slightly. An angle so small that a person would have to slow the moment down to see it, and it wasn't correct. It had never been correct. It was the thing every teacher she had ever studied under had tried and failed to repair. And then that wrist opened, and the arm reached its full length, and that tiny flaw disappeared inside the perfection of everything else. The violin's final note stretched outward, growing thinner and thinner. Mari lowered herself. Her knees bent, her body bowed, one hand touched the marble floor, and she stopped there. The note faded, and at that exact second, the two great doors at the far end of the room flew open. Augustin Voss stood in the doorway with snow still resting on the shoulders of his coat. He had traveled for 12 hours to return earlier than planned, and throughout the final stretch from the airport he had imagined this room in his mind. And nothing in that imagining resembled what lay before him now. 40 phones were raised. A woman in a silver gown stood at the edge of the room, with a stack of money still in her hand, her fingers having forgotten what they were holding. And at the foot of the wall on the right, placed neatly side by side with their heels perfectly aligned, was a pair of rubber-soled work shoes. He looked at those shoes longer than he looked at anything else in the room. Then he looked toward the center, where a woman was slowly rising from her final position, barefoot on the black marble, breathing hard, and he had never seen that face in his life. Not once. He was certain of it. But he had arrived in time to see the final 2 seconds of the piece. He had seen the left wrist tilt inward before opening, and something beneath his ribs slipped out of place. He had seen that tiny imperfection exactly 4 times in his life, during an October 3 years earlier, from the 3rd row on the left. He didn't remember the dancer's face. No one could, beneath the makeup and the wig and the stage lights. But he remembered that wrist, because he had sat in the darkness for 4 performances in a row and watched it, and because during those 4 performances he had cried, and he hadn't cried since he was 12 years old. He had tickets for every season at that theater, and no one knew. He bought them under a name that wasn't his own. He always purchased exactly 1 seat, always in the same place. And he sat there alone because that was where his mother would have sat had she still been alive. Because she had walked past that building her entire life and had never once stepped inside. No one in the organization knew. No one in Boston knew. Augustin entered the room. The sound of his shoes against the marble was the only sound left in all 22 rooms of the house. No one moved. He walked past Sloane without looking at her, not even once, and she stepped back half a pace as though something had touched her. He went to the wall on the right. He bent down and picked up the shoes. Then he carried them into the center of the room and placed them beside Mari's feet, neatly, with the heels aligned, exactly as they had been before. Then he straightened, removed the black wool coat still damp with snow, and draped it over her shoulders. He hadn't spoken a single word. All 40 people understood everything. Mari looked up at him. She was still breathing hard, and her hair had come loose from the knot at the back of her head, and she looked directly into his face in the candlelight, and something passed through her eyes. "I remember you," she said. Augustin stood still. "You sat beside my husband." He didn't understand. "What? You were on the left," she said. "My husband was sitting on your right." The room ceased to exist. He heard her continue, her voice very soft, meant only for the 2 of them. "I didn't recognize your face at first, Mr. Voss. Stage lights are too bright, and the theater was too dark. But just now, when you stood there in the doorway, the way you tilted your head, the way your fingers locked together in absolute silence, it was identical to the man who sat next to Emery for 4 nights in a row. You were the only one in that entire row who never applauded. You just sat there." She took a breath. "For 3 years I've believed you were his friend, and Augustin Voss, standing in the middle of the ballroom in his own house, understood. The final night of that season, the man seated on his right, a man in a sweater, unremarkable in every way, who had sat motionless through the entire performance, just as Augustin had, When the curtain fell and the lights came up, the man had turned toward him, a complete stranger, his eyes still red, and spoken a single sentence. Beautiful, wasn't it? Augustin hadn't answered. He had nodded, stood, walked out, and never thought about it again, except that he had thought about it many times over the past 3 years without understanding why. That sentence surfacing at strange moments while he never knew where it had come from. Now he knew. The man who had spoken those words to him was the husband of the woman standing before him now, barefoot, wearing the uniform of the cleaning company he paid, breathing hard beneath his coat. Augustin turned around. It was the first time all evening that he looked toward his fiancée, and Sloane had been given nearly a minute to prepare for this moment, and 1 minute wasn't enough. "Tell me," he said, "exactly what happened here." His voice was ordinary. That was what made the entire room turn cold. Sloane let out a small laugh, the kind of laugh she had used all her life to make things seem lighter. "Gus, come on. It was only a little fun. A small party game. You were late, so you didn't see the beginning. Everyone was taking part." She tipped her chin toward Mari. Besides, she agreed to it herself. Augustin said nothing for 3 seconds. "Agreed to it herself," he repeated. He spoke slowly, separating each word, like a man holding something in his mouth to discover what it tasted like. "You stood in front of 40 people in my house. You held up money. You called out a woman who was working, who was being paid to be here, and you asked her in front of all of them, and you call that agreeing freely. That isn't what happened. If she said no, the entire city would spend tonight telling the story of how the Voss house cleaner was afraid. If she said yes, you got what you wanted. You didn't offer her a choice, Sloane. You closed a door and told her to choose which wall she wanted." Sloane began to flush along her throat, just above the pearls. "Gus, she's a cleaner." The room heard those words. All 40 people heard them. Augustin didn't move. When he spoke again, his voice didn't rise. It grew quieter. "My mother was a cleaner. There was a house on Beacon Hill with a narrow servant's staircase running behind the kitchen. And on the 4th step from the bottom sat a boy with his knees drawn to his chest because he had been told to stay there and not go anywhere. Guests were visiting that evening. He could hear the glasses, the laughter, someone telling a story that made the entire room laugh. Then he heard glass break. Then he heard a woman's voice, not angry, only amused, saying, 'Oh dear, someone call Rosalind up here.' The boy had edged forward until he could see through the crack in the door. His mother was kneeling on the rug among all those shoes. She wiped at a stain of red wine with both hands, her head bowed low. While above her the story continued. No one paused. No one looked down. And someone laughed again at something else. She finished cleaning. She stood, and on her way out, when she had passed beyond the room's line of sight, but not beyond her son's, she coughed into a handkerchief, looked down at it for 1 second, then folded it quickly, slipped it into her apron pocket, and kept walking. She didn't know the boy was watching. The boy was 12 years old. She died that February. He bore the name Voss because she had stubbornly written it on his birth certificate, while the man who gave that name had another family on the other side of the city and didn't come to the funeral. "There is exactly one rule in this house," Augustin said. "Only one. Renz knows it. Mrs. Ottilie knows it. Everyone who has ever worked for me knows, and I told it to you the week you moved in." He looked at her. "No one is humiliated beneath my roof. Not my guests, not my enemies, and absolutely not the person cleaning my floors." Sloane opened her mouth and nothing came out. "Do you know why I'm not angry with you about the money?" he said. "Because money is the easiest thing in the world to understand. Everyone needs money. I need money. You need money far more desperately than you've told me, and I've known that for a long time, Sloane." And I said nothing. She blinked. "What I can't understand," he continued. And now his voice was so quiet that the people at the far end of the room had to lean forward, "is why, when you are afraid, the first person you reach for is someone who can't fight back." He picked up the nearest empty glass from the table and set it down gently, without a sound. "You didn't break a rule tonight. Rules can be broken and repaired. You showed me exactly who you are, and that is something that can't be repaired." Sloane understood what was happening, and she did what people always do when the ice beneath their feet begins to crack. She reached forward. "The invitations have already been sent, Gus." Her voice changed. It was no longer soft. It had edges now. 400 of them. They're already inside people's homes. The church is booked. People have bought plane tickets, rearranged their schedules, and some are flying in from Europe. What do you intend to do about that? Augustin looked at her for a moment. There will be 400 letters, he said. Rents will send them tomorrow morning. That was the entire answer. Nothing more. No explanation, not one word about what those letters would say, not one word about who would pay for those plane tickets. And it was that clean finality that told the entire room the matter was over. That it had been over before she opened her mouth. That it had ended somewhere in the time it took him to walk from the doorway to the center of the room. Sloane stood there. Then she did the last thing left to her. She turned her head and looked around. She looked at the man from the seaport whom she had spent 10 minutes nodding at. He was staring at the floor. She looked at the two women beside the stone column, the women whose children's names she had remembered. One was turning her glass slowly in her hand. The other had turned completely away. She looked at every face in the room she had spent 2 weeks selecting, 40 names, each one a decision, and not one of those 40 people looked back at her. Not because they hated her. It was worse than that. Because they had already finished calculating, every one of them. At the same moment, in the same second, the result was that she was no longer someone worth standing beside. Her fingers opened. The stack of money fell onto the marble floor. It made almost no sound, only a faint slap, and the bills on top slid free and spread into a fan across the black stone. She didn't pick them up. She turned and walked away. The silver gown dragged slightly across the floor on her first step, then caught up with her, and the sound of her heels began to strike the marble, steady and sharp, while the entire room stood in silence and listened. The sound passed between 2 rows of people parting before her. It moved into the entrance hall. It grew fainter beneath the high ceiling. Then came the sound of the great door opening, and a rush of cold air swept all the way into the ballroom, making hundreds of candle flames lean in the same direction, and the door closed. After that, there was nothing. Augustin turned back toward his 40 guests. He looked at them for a long time. Every one of you stood here, he said. Every one of you saw what happened. And not one of you said a word. He said nothing else. He didn't need to. People began to leave, slowly and awkwardly, no one saying goodbye to anyone. And within 15 minutes, the room was empty. Mrs. Audley walked through it, with a brass candle snuffer, and extinguished each flame one by one, while darkness crept inward from the corners, until at last only 3 people remained beneath the light of a single candle holder that was still burning. Mari had sat down in a chair against the wall. She was bent forward putting on her shoes, and she did it slowly, and when she slipped her left foot inside, there was a very brief pause before she pulled the laces tight. Augustin stood several steps away. "You're in pain," he said. It wasn't a question. Mari didn't look up. She tied her shoe with 2 loops, the way she always did. "I haven't danced an entire piece in 3 years," she said. "Why tonight?" She sat upright. His coat was still around her shoulders, and she had only just realized it, and she lifted a hand as though to remove it, then stopped. She looked down at her hands. Mrs. Audley stood in the corner with the candle snuffer in her hand and didn't extinguish the final flame. "Because my boy drew me dancing," Mari said. Augustin didn't understand at first. "He's never seen me dance," she said. "Not once. He simply imagined it." No one said anything more. Augustin nodded once, exactly once, and asked no further questions. In the middle of the room, on the black marble floor, the stack of money still lay where it had fallen. Not one of those 40 people touched it on the way out. Mrs. Audley didn't pick it up. Renz walked past it twice and didn't look at it. It remained there all night, spread like a fan beneath the final candlelight, until morning came. Renz Kovac waited until the Bright Path vehicle had carried the last worker beyond the gate. Then he entered the study, where Augustin stood before the window with both hands in his trouser pockets. And he said what it was his duty to say. "By tomorrow morning, the entire North End will know," he said. "By noon, Beacon Hill too. 40 mouths boss, and not one of them knows exactly what happened, so they'll invent the rest for themselves." He paused. "People will say you ended your engagement over a cleaner. They'll say you've gone soft." Augustin didn't turn around at once. Outside, the snow was still falling, slowly and straight down, with no wind. "Do you remember why my father died, Renz?" Renz was silent for a moment. Because Salvi was holding the knife," Augustin said. "That wasn't the reason. That was only what happened last." He turned around. "My father let Salvi drive for him for 20 years. 20 years. And not once did he ask how many children Salvi had. He talked in the back seat as though the front seat were empty. He left Salvi standing outside in the rain while he ate dinner. He didn't beat Salvi, didn't steal from him, didn't do anything you could point to and give a name. He simply decided that some people didn't need to be treated with respect. And he lived with that decision for 20 years. And one day that decision was sitting in the front seat with a knife. He looked at Renz. My father didn't die because he was soft. My father died because he believed respect was something he could afford to withhold. Renz said nothing. Tell them this, Augustin said. Augustin Voss didn't send his fiancée away because of a cleaner. Augustin Voss sent his fiancée away because she humiliated someone beneath his roof. And that law existed before her, and it will remain after her. And if anyone in the organization thinks that makes me soft, tell them to come see me. I have time. No one came. Not that week, not that month, not ever. Renz remained there a little longer. Then he spoke, and his voice had changed. I was there, boss. Augustin looked at him. In January. The incident with the wine glass on the rug in the East Room. I stood in the hallway doorway and watched from beginning to end. She knelt on the floor for nearly half an hour while the other woman stood there watching, and I was there and I didn't step in. Why didn't you stop her? Because she was your fiancée. Augustin said nothing. Renz looked down for a moment, then raised his eyes. No, he said. That's the answer I've been rehearsing in my head all evening. That's the excuse. The truth is that I was afraid. I was afraid that if I stepped in, I would have to tell you, and if I told you, I would have to choose a side inside your house, and I didn't want to be placed in that position. So I stood still. Augustin nodded slowly. Thank you for not lying to me. There's one more thing, Renz said, and you're not going to like this. Say it. That woman is in this house because of you. Augustin stood motionless. I warned you about Bright Path. I told you there would be 8 strangers coming in 3 times a week. I told you it was an open door, and you were looking out the window, and you said 3 words to me. Renz didn't repeat those 3 words. He didn't need to. I walked out and let it happen because you were the boss and you had spoken. So if you're trying to find the door that opened and allowed her to enter this house tonight, that was it. It wasn't her. It was you. Augustine didn't answer. Renz nodded once and walked out, and the door closed behind him, just as it had closed in the harbor office that day. Augustin didn't sleep in Brookline that night. He took the car and drove into the city through the empty streets, then went to Mission Hill and parked outside a red brick building with an iron fire escape twisting across its front. He took out his wallet. In the back compartment, behind everything else, was an old key that had gone dull with age. He opened the entrance door, climbed to the 2nd floor, and unlocked the 2nd door on the left. There was nothing inside. He had bought the apartment the week he took control, and he had never renovated it, never rented it out, never brought a single object into it. There were only wooden floors, a bare ceiling bulb without a shade, and one chair facing the window. He sat in the chair and didn't turn on the light. The window looked down onto the street. There was a place on the floor, about 1 step from the window, that he knew very well. It was where his mother used to stand on the evenings when she waited. She never said whom she was waiting for. She only stood there with one hand holding the opposite elbow, looking down at the street, and that man never came, not that evening, not any evening. Augustin sat in the darkness for a very long time. He didn't pray, he didn't speak to the dead, he only sat there and looked through the window, and eventually he thought of a woman somewhere in this city. Somewhere that very night, sitting alone just as he was in a room, with no one else in it. Renz called at 7 o'clock in the morning, and he said nothing over the phone except that he needed 10 minutes. He arrived at the harbor office with a phone that wasn't his tucked inside his coat, placed it on the desk in front of Augustin, and opened it. This belongs to Holloway, he said. I got it at 4 o'clock this morning. He'll have it back before noon, and he'll never know where it went. On the screen was a conversation. The first message had been sent at 9:38 the previous evening, at the exact moment when the 4 musicians were waiting for one another, and a woman was standing alone in the middle of the marble floor. It had been sent to Sloane Whitaker Reese. It contained only 3 words. I'm recording this. The second message had been sent 11 minutes later, after everything was over. Would you like to discuss my debt? Augustin read it twice. How much does he owe us? Not much by your standards, Renz said. A great deal by his. His auction house is sitting on 2 loans no bank was willing to approve. So he came to us 4 years ago, and since then he's paid in full but always late. He came to the harbor in November to ask for more time. Renz tapped the screen lightly. He didn't raise his phone because he thought it was funny, boss. He raised it because he saw a piece of evidence walking into the middle of the room all by itself. Your fiancé humiliating a member of your household staff in front of 40 people, with sound and pictures. He planned to sell it back to her. He planned to trade it for his debt, and now she has nothing left to offer him, Augustin said. Now he's sitting in his house with the most valuable thing he has ever held in his hands and no one to sell it to, and he's terrified because he knows you'll find out. Renz looked up. I can go take the device and erase every copy. Give me until noon. No. Renz stood still. Augustin wasn't looking at him. He was looking at the phone on the desk, and during the long silence that followed, he thought about something that hadn't appeared in any of Renz's calculations. The night before, a woman had stood on his floor and done something she hadn't done in 3 years, and she had paid for it with something he still didn't fully understand, and that moment had existed only once in the world. No one had recorded it properly. No one had been hired to record it. Of the 40 phones raised that evening, most had captured only a few seconds before their owners lowered them because they had forgotten what they were holding. Only one person had recorded from beginning to end, holding the phone with both hands at chest level at exactly the right angle, and he had done it for the filthiest reason Augustin had ever heard. Boss. He recorded the entire piece, Augustin said. Didn't he? Renz hesitated, from the first note to the last. It includes the moment you entered. Cut me out. Renz didn't understand at first. Cut me out of it. Cut her out. Cut out the money. Cut out the part where she speaks. Cut out the laughter. Cut out every face in the room. Cut out everything that reveals where this happened, or whose house it was. Then what will be left, boss? Augustin looked up. She will, he said. That is the only thing in that recording worth preserving. Renz stood there for a moment, and inside his mind was a list of practical objections involving security, the law, and the organization. But he looked at his employer's face and didn't speak a single one of them. He nodded. Tell Holloway this, Augustin said. His debt is erased. All of it. Tomorrow morning he wakes up owing no one anything, and he can sleep peacefully for the rest of his life. In return, he gives us the original every copy, and he edits it exactly as I've instructed, and he never tells another living soul that a complete version ever existed. And the edited version? It belongs to him, Augustin said. He can do whatever he wants with it. Renz picked up the phone. At the door he stopped. You know he'll post it. I know. And you know she'll never know who edited it. Augustin turned back toward the window and looked down at the harbor, where the cranes were beginning to move through the fog of a new morning. Yes, he said. And that was why, several days later, the thing that appeared on the internet was only 2 minutes and 40 seconds long. There was no introduction, no explanatory title, no face except one. No money, no candles, no 40 guests, no man standing in a doorway with snow on his shoulders. There was only the sound of a violin and a barefoot woman on black stone, and no one who watched it knew that someone had carefully removed every trace of himself from what they were seeing. Mrs. Ottilie Brannigan waited until the afternoon. When the house had been put back in order, every half-burned candle had been removed from its holder, and the marble floor had returned to the exact appearance of a place where nothing had ever happened. Then she knocked on the study door, entered, and placed a sheet of paper folded into quarters on Augustin's desk. This fell from her pocket, she said, when she bent down to put on her shoes. I found it beneath the chair this morning. Augustin unfolded it. A woman stood on one leg, the other bent behind her, both arms raised high above her head, her fingers straining to meet at the top. Her hair streamed to one side. Around her were yellow dots, so many that they covered the entire page, and the artist had pressed the colored pencil so hard that the paper had worn thin in places. He sat with it for a very long time. How do you intend to return it to her, Master Augustin? Mrs. Ottilie asked. Her voice was ordinary, the same voice she used when speaking about walnut and hot water. You don't even know where she lives. He looked up. You do, no, she said. I know other things. She stood there with her hands clasped in front of her apron, as she always did. Do you remember the evening you took me to see her? Augustin didn't understand at first. Then he did. It had been 3 years earlier, one evening in October, and he had sat in the car outside her house for over 10 minutes before ringing the bell, because he hadn't known how to ask. She had worn her best coat. She had sat beside him in the darkness, and hadn't spoken a word throughout the entire performance. She was the only woman he had ever taken to the ballet in his life. The first performance, she said. You took me to the first one. You went alone to the next 3, Mrs. Audley. The first day she entered this house, she said, I stood in the service hallway and looked down the line of people from that company, and when I reached her, I recognized her. Not her face. I didn't remember her face. It was the way she stood. The way she stood when she wasn't thinking about standing. I had watched her stand that way for 3 hours in that theater, and 2 years later she was standing the same way in the hallway of your house with a bucket in her hand. The room was very quiet. I turned away, she said, and I said nothing. For 2 years, Augustin placed the drawing on the desk. Why didn't you tell me? Mrs. Audley looked at him, and there was something in that look very much like pity, not for him, but for the question. Because she didn't want anyone to know, she said. She wiped both hands slowly against her apron, though they were dry. Master Augustin, I've lived longer than you, and I've worked in houses like this since before you were born, and I'm going to tell you something you don't yet know. There is one thing poor people possess even less of than money. Money they can still earn a little at a time, week after week. They can still scrape some together. But not this. She looked directly at him. It is the right to choose who knows what about them. The whole world reads their records. The bank knows. The hospital knows. The company that pays them knows. People can find out whom they owe, where they sleep, where they have failed, and no one asks permission. Her voice never rose. She had managed to keep exactly one thing. One. She had kept the right to walk into this house and be a cleaner, no more and no less. That was what she chose. And if I had climbed the stairs, knocked on this door, and told you who she was, I would have taken that from her too, and she would have had nothing left. She paused. I wouldn't do that. Not to her. Not to anyone. Augustin couldn't speak. He looked down at the drawing on the desk, at the yellow dots, at the hand that had pressed too hard. You cried last night, he said. Mrs. Audley didn't answer at once. She looked toward the window, where darkness had already fallen, and when she spoke, her voice was no longer even for the first time in 2 years. You think I cried because she danced beautifully, she said. Master Augustin, I carried you before you knew how to walk. I lived 3 doors from your mother. I knew her before you knew her. She turned back toward him. Last night, I stood in the corner of that room and looked toward the center, and I didn't see a young woman dancing. I saw Rosalind. She picked up the empty tray from the desk and walked toward the door. You asked whether I know where she lives, she said from the threshold without turning around. No, but you have an entire organization, don't you? And she walked out. Augustin called Renz the following morning and said he needed an address. He didn't explain why, and Renz didn't ask. By noon, Renz returned with a thin folder and placed it on the desk, then said she lived on the 3rd floor in Roxbury and read out the name of the street. Then he remained standing there. What else is there? Augustin asked. There's something else, Renz said. I didn't ask your permission. It's what my people do with every name you send down to us. We check the records first, then we find the address. It's automatic. This came back before I had time to decide whether it should have come back at all. He moved the top sheet aside. Augustin looked down. Her name appeared at the top of the page in capital letters, dry and impersonal, written in the manner used by documents that reduced human beings to a series of data points. Beneath it was her date of birth. Below that, on the 2nd line, under the heading marked creditor, was a single word. Crescent. Nothing in the room changed. The clock on the wall continued ticking. Outside the window, the cranes continued turning. Augustin sat perfectly still and read the line a 2nd time, then a 3rd, and each time the word remained exactly where it was. Renz, he said. Bring me Pell's ledger, boss, bring. Me, the ledger. Osric Pell was a name Augustin heard perhaps twice a year and never thought about between those occasions. He lent money in Dorchester. He bought debt. He did the things no one in the organization wanted to do with their own hands, but everyone wanted to profit from. And for 3 years he had paid tribute to the Voss family without missing a single month, a portion of every dollar he collected. Renz brought the records 4 hours later. It wasn't one ledger. It was 3 hardbound volumes and a hard drive, and Augustin read for 7 minutes without speaking, while Renz stood near the door and didn't sit down. It was listed in the 3rd quarter of the year before last. 1 line, Crescent Recovery Group. Medical portfolio, purchased from the hospital system, 4,000 accounts, bulk price. Beside it was a signature, his signature. He remembered the day he signed it. He remembered because there had been 30 other things requiring his signature. and he had signed the entire stack at once, while standing in an airport with a phone pressed between his shoulder and his ear. 4,000 accounts. 4,000 people. 4,000 names he had never read, not because he hadn't wanted to, but because reading them had never, not for a single second in his life, occurred to him as something a person could do. He set the papers down. Outside, darkness had already fallen. 3 years, he said. Yes, boss, which means that every 2 weeks, someone takes part of her wages before the money ever reaches her hands. And part of that portion goes up to Pell, and part of that comes up to me. Renz didn't answer. There was nothing to answer. She knelt on my floor, Augustin said. He didn't speak loudly. She cleaned my marble 3 nights a week for 2 years to repay her hospital debt, whose money was flowing straight into my pocket through Crescent. She traveled 45 minutes by bus to work in my house, and part of the money she earned there was deducted from her paycheck money that traveled through Pell's collectors, came back here, and sat in the same safe as the money I paid the company that sent her to me. Renz said what anyone in his position would have said, and he said it because he believed it was true. You couldn't have known, boss. 4,000 names. No one reads 4,000 names. There isn't a bank in the world that reads 4,000 names. Augustin stared down at the page for a long time. That's right, he said. 4,000 names. And I placed one signature over every one of their lives without reading a single one. He looked up. You think that's my excuse, Renz? It's the charge against me. Renz stood motionless. My father let a man drive for him for 20 years without ever asking how many children he had, Augustin said. I sat here and signed my name across 4,000 lives in 3 seconds at an airport. Tell me, where is the difference? He rose and walked to the window. Call Pell, he said. Tonight, the order had 3 parts, and he spoke them very slowly so he wouldn't have to repeat himself. First, the account under that name was to be closed. Not reduced, not extended, closed. Second, Pell would send her a letter on Crescent letterhead, and that letter would say the debt had been paid through the hospital system's financial assistance program, and it wouldn't say by whom, and it would never say by whom, and if Osric Pell opened his mouth about this to any living creature, he would no longer have a business worth opening his mouth about. Third, 3 years of his tribute, Augustin said. Calculate the amount for me. Renz calculated it. He read the figure aloud. Augustin showed no reaction to the number. Transfer all of it to the Rosalind Foundation, he said. Today, before I leave this room, and Mareva Aubriet Vance never knew. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, printed on official Crescent letterhead in dry administrative language. And she read it 3 times, while standing in the hallway of the building, before she understood what it was saying. The massive hospital debt that had strangled her finances for years was gone, completely cleared. She believed there must have been some program she had applied for long ago and forgotten, or some fund intended for cases like hers, and she stood leaning against the row of metal mailboxes and wept with gratitude toward a system that had never given her anything in her entire life. Now, the only weight left on her shoulders was the $89 she chose to send to Dorchester each month, a small, peaceful tribute she could finally pay without fear of starving. Augustin allowed her to believe that, because some gifts are only truly gifts when the person receiving them never knows who gave them. Saturday evening in the Roxbury kitchen brought instant noodles and the radio. The radio was an old battery-powered thing that sat on top of the refrigerator, and it picked up exactly 3 stations, and one of those stations was playing a piece that night with horns and a very clear beat. Mari was waiting for the water to boil. She tilted her head and listened, then clapped once directly on the beat. Josiah looked up. She clapped again, then again. 1, 2, 3, 4. The boy looked at her hands, then at her face, and she nodded, and he clapped along. He missed the beat. Mari slowed down, clapped louder, counted aloud, 1, 2, 3, 4. And on the 3rd try, Josiah found it. And when he did, his eyes widened and he kept clapping, perfectly in time for 8 full beats, and Mari threw both hands into the air, as though their team had just scored. Then she took both of the boy's hands and pulled him up from his chair. And the 2 of them began dancing around the tiny kitchen table. And it wasn't really dancing. It was 2 people tripping over each other's feet in a space barely 3 steps wide. And Josiah laughed so hard that he had to stop to breathe, and the kettle began to whistle, and neither of them cared. It was a good Saturday night. There were nights like that, and they didn't require much. Then someone knocked on the door. Mari opened it with the wooden spoon still in her hand. The woman standing in the hallway was somewhere in her 40s, wearing a heavy coat and a plastic identification card on a cord around her neck, and she carried a document case in one hand. She said her name was Marguerite Oduya, and that she was from Child Protective Services, and Mari felt all the blood in her body drain into her feet. Mrs. Oduya saw it. She had seen it many times in her life, and she didn't allow it to last longer than a second. Ms. Aubrey Vance, she said from the threshold, before she even stepped inside, "I need you to hear this sentence before you hear anything else. The boy is fine. More than fine. I met with Mrs. Nordquist this afternoon. I reviewed his school records, and I've read everything in his file." She looked directly into Mari's eyes. "I'm not here because of the boy. I'm here because of you." Josiah poked his head out from the kitchen. Mrs. Oduya waved to him, and the boy waved back, then returned to his drawings. They sat at the kitchen table. Mrs. Oduya opened her case and spoke in the voice of someone who had done this work for a long time, and had learned that the kindest way was to be direct. "A letter was sent to our office. Anonymously." She placed one hand on the folder. "There is only one thing in it worth discussing, and I checked it, and it's true. Your guardianship paperwork is overdue for conversion. That is the entire issue, Ms. Aubrey Vance. There is no other problem. You signed temporary papers and never filed the remaining documents, and the deadline passed quite some time ago." Mari sat still. She remembered that paper. She remembered it lying in the second drawer beneath the other letters, and she remembered thinking next week, then next month, then when work became less demanding. "I'll help you complete it," Mrs. Oduya said. "It will take 3 appointments, and I have the forms in my car." Then she did something she wasn't required to do. She closed the folder. "But there is something I want to tell you," she said, "and whether you want to hear it is your choice." The letter was anonymous, but it wasn't written by some neighbor. Whoever wrote it knew which shifts you worked. Whoever wrote it knew what percentage of your wages was being deducted. She looked at Mari. There are only 2 places in the world that could know both of those things at the same time. One is your bank, silence. The other is whoever pays your wages. Mari said nothing for a long while. Outside the window a car passed along the street. "Would you like me to find out who it was?" Mrs. Oduya asked. "I can, not quickly, but I can." Mari shook her head very slowly. "No," she said. Mrs. Oduya waited. "Because the answer will be someone who has never spent even 1 second thinking about me," Mari said. "People don't hate me. They simply need something, and I happen to be standing in their way." She looked down at the tabletop. "I can endure being hated, Mom. At least when someone hates you, they have to remember your name. I can't endure being nothing more than a name standing in someone's path." Mrs. Oduya closed her case. She had intended to stand. Then she didn't. She remained seated and looked at the woman across from her, the woman whose wooden spoon still lay on the table beside a stack of bills, and she asked a question that didn't appear on any form issued by the department. "Are you all right?" Mari opened her mouth to say that she was fine. It was the answer she had given everyone for nearly 3 years. It was already waiting there, polished and ready to come out, and it didn't. She rose from the chair, took 2 steps toward the kitchen, then sat down on the floor with her back against the cabinet and broke apart. She hadn't cried when the hospital called her. She hadn't cried at the funeral home. Hadn't cried when she signed the installment agreement. Hadn't cried when she pressed the cancel button on the bus. Hadn't cried when 40 people laughed in a room filled with candles. She cried now, on the floor of her own kitchen, because a woman she had never met before had just asked her a question no one had asked her in 3 years. Mrs. Oduya didn't come over to help her stand. She simply remained seated at the table and allowed it to happen, because she knew that sometimes helping someone to their feet was the worst thing a person could do. In the next room, Josiah was still drawing and the radio was still playing. On the other side of the city, Augustin Voss read the copy of the letter his people had obtained and reached for his phone, and his sister Delphine, the only member of the family who had never been involved with the organization and the finest attorney he knew, placed her hand on his arm. "The moment you touch that case," she said, "you prove her right. You'll prove that the boy is only safe when a man with a name like yours intervenes." That is exactly what she wants. So he didn't call the department. He called Sloan. The call lasted 40 seconds. "I'm going to say this once," he said. "You can't frighten me anymore, Gus. I'm not threatening you. I'm explaining." He was silent for 3 seconds. You're waiting for me to destroy you. I'm not going to. I won't call your creditors. I won't say a word in Beacon Hill. I won't do anything at all. Then why are you calling? So you'll know that I'm not going to do anything, he said. Everything that is about to happen to you, Sloane, will happen because of you, not because of me. That is your punishment. You'll never be able to tell anyone that some mafia man ruined your life. You'll have to live with the truth that you did it to yourself. Pell's ledger was still lying on Augustine's desk 3 days after the night he ordered the account closed. He had intended to return it. He hadn't. There was something about his profession that he had learned very early, that once a man opened a ledger and found something he didn't want to find, he had to finish reading, because whatever he chose to overlook would always return to find him at the most inconvenient moment. So he finished reading. He worked backward through it, month by month, and he read slowly because this time he read every line. He found it one evening under miscellaneous expenses, in the year when everything in the organization still bore another man's signature. One line: compensation, traffic incident, a date, the name of a district, and a name, Bertram Lask. Augustine knew the area. Everyone in Boston knew the road that ran along the river, and he knew the month, and he had known both of those things since the night a woman sat in a chair in his ballroom and told him that her husband had been seated on his right. He opened the hard drive and searched for the name. It was there. Bertram Lask had driven for one of the organization's freight routes, a small, insignificant route, the kind no one watched closely. He had been carrying a shipment that evening, and he had been drinking, and he had run a red light on the road along the river, and afterward he hadn't stopped. He abandoned the vehicle several blocks from the scene and walked away. The license plate on the vehicle didn't belong to it. Then he called his people, and his people called upward, and above them sat a man at the very desk where Augustine was sitting now, and that man made the calculation the organization had been making for 60 years. If a driver was arrested, the police would ask what he had been carrying. If a driver disappeared, no one would ask anything at all. So Lask was taken away, the records were cleaned, a payment was made, and that payment appeared in the ledger under miscellaneous expenses with the words traffic incident. It happened 3 months before Augustin Voss took control. He hadn't given the order. He hadn't signed anything. He hadn't been inside this building when it happened. He hadn't known that a man named Bertram Lask existed anywhere in the world until that night. He sat with the page for a very long time. Not because he was guilty. He had considered that question and turned it in every possible direction, and there was no direction in which he was guilty, not in any sense that a court, a priest, or Augustine himself could name. What kept him sitting there was something else. He had seized the organization to avenge his mother. That was the only reason he had ever had. He had spent 8 years making the name on his birth certificate mean something, turning it into something that forced the entire city to bow its head, and for 8 years he had told himself that he was different, that he had his own laws, that beneath his roof no one would be humiliated. And now he sat there looking down at one line of writing and understood that the machine he had seized, the machine he had cleaned and repaired and kept running smoothly, was the very machine that had made that woman what she was. It had taken away the man who sat beside him in the theater. It had left behind a hospital bill that it later purchased and collected payments on. It had sent her to clean his floors because his fiancée wanted a commission, and he had said to let her. It took part of her wages every 2 weeks, and a portion of that money flowed back into the safe in this room. He hadn't rescued her from anything. He was what had happened to her. The matter of Bertram Lask was dealt with that week, and no record of it appeared in any ledger, and Rents didn't ask, and Augustine didn't tell him. But when it was finished, nothing had changed. The man from the theater still didn't return. The voice she had lost still didn't return. That was what Augustine had never understood until that night, that there were things people did only to make themselves feel better, and those things couldn't touch even a millimeter of what had been broken. He never told Mari. He thought about it many times in the months that followed, and each time he turned it over in his hands, and each time he set it down again. She might want to know. She had the right to know. He could sit across from her and speak the name and the month and the road, and she would have an answer to the question the police had stopped calling her about. And after 3 years, with nowhere to put her anger, she would finally have a place for it. And then she would have one more thing she had never asked for. She would have him. She would look into his face and see the machine behind it. And every time she entered a room where he was present, she would have to carry that month with her. That road, the sound of brakes she could no longer remember. He had lived with his mother inside his mind since he was 12 years old. He knew exactly how much such a thing weighed. Some truths aren't gifts. Some truths are only burdens changing hands. The video appeared during the second week. No name was attached to it. There was no introduction. And it spread through the small world to which it belonged, from one dance school account to another, then to people who had once studied dance, then to people who had once known someone who had studied dance. More than 300,000 people watched it. Thousands left comments, saying they had cried. A few online newspapers wrote brief pieces about a mysterious video of unknown origin. And then, like everything on the internet, it sank away. A week later, no one mentioned it anymore. That was what no one told people about becoming famous. It didn't pay the bills. On Monday morning, Mari still woke at 5 o'clock. She still walked to the bus stop. Dryer number 4 still needed to be kicked at the base. She was still short on rent, not by much, but short. And 300,000 people had cried because of her. Yet not one of them knew her name, or knew that she existed in one specific place on the map of this city. Fame never reached her. It only passed over her head and continued on its way. Sloane Whitaker Reese collapsed, but not because of the video. She collapsed because of the 40 people. Upper-class Boston was a village disguised as a city, and before breakfast the following morning, all of Beacon Hill knew that Augustin Voss had ended his engagement in the middle of his own engagement party, in front of everyone, and had walked out while the other woman remained in the room. No one knew exactly why. That was what destroyed her. Had people known the reason would have had limits, it would have had a shape, it would have grown old. But they didn't know, so they invented the rest. And what people invented was always worse than the truth. Within a few weeks, the calls she made began going unanswered. Then the calls she didn't want to receive began coming. The shell remained standing a little longer, as shells often do, and then it didn't. 3 weeks after that night, Augustin Voss drove to Roxbury. He didn't bring money. He climbed 19 steps, knocked on the door, and Mari opened it wearing the expression of someone waiting for bad news, because that was the only kind of news that had ever climbed as high as the 3rd floor. He placed a folder on the kitchen table. It wasn't a check, it was a contract. The ballet school south of the city had a scholarship program for children in the foster care system, and the program had been without a director for 2 years because the work was demanding. The pay was low, and no one in the profession wanted the position. "You'll have to do the job well," he said, "or they'll fire you, and I won't interfere." Not once, Mari looked down at the papers for a long time. "Why me?" "Because you were the child who received that scholarship," he said. "I had someone check the list from that year. You're the only person on it who remained in the profession." She said nothing for a while. Then she looked up. 3 weeks ago, you refused $5,000, he said. "Why are you accepting this?" Mari placed her hand on the contract. "Because that time someone threw money at me to see whether I would pick it up," she said. "This time, you're giving me work to do." She looked directly at him. "Those aren't the same thing, Mr. Voss. They aren't even related." Augustin didn't answer. There was nothing to answer. The sound of small footsteps came from the kitchen doorway. Josiah stood there holding a sheet of paper, staring at the very tall man in the black coat standing in his kitchen. Then the boy walked over and held out the drawing. Augustin took it. On the page was a woman standing on one leg with both hands raised toward the sky, while yellow dots covered the entire sheet. He looked at it, and he had seen a picture almost exactly like it on his desk, and he didn't say so. Then he did something Renz Kovac would never have believed had anyone told him. He sat down, not in a chair. He sat on the kitchen floor, directly on the old tiles that were cracked in several places, the hem of his black wool coat touching the grout, and he placed the drawing across his knee and studied it carefully, longer than any adult had ever studied one of the boy's pictures. "You drew it correctly," he said. Josiah looked at him. Augustin pointed to the page. "The right hand is higher than the left." "That is exactly how it was." Josiah spun around to look at his sister, his face lighting up like a lamp that had just been switched on, and the boy laughed, the kind of laughter that held nothing back. And by the sink, Mari turned her face away and raised one hand to cover her mouth. 1 year later, on an April evening, The theater south of the city was lit for a performance with no famous names on the poster. 14 children stood behind the curtain, the youngest 7 years old, the oldest 15, all of them from the foster care system, all of them having practiced for 8 months in a basement studio without mirrors until Mari managed to get them some. She stood in the left wing with a clipboard in her hand, and she didn't dance. She would never dance again. The doctor had spoken plainly to her the previous autumn, without softening the truth, telling her that the damage in her left calf wasn't going to improve, that it would continue in the only direction it knew, and that a day would come, perhaps far away, perhaps not very far at all, when she would no longer be able to stand. She had sat in that clinic and listened to every word, then signed the paper confirming that she had been informed. She continued teaching. Every day she could still stand was a day stolen back from time, and she had decided she would keep stealing until the final second. The letter from Crescent had arrived long ago, and she still kept it in the second drawer, on top of the stack rather than buried beneath it, and she still believed that some hospital program had found her file. No one ever told her otherwise. She never recovered those 3 recordings. 3 repair shops had said no, and there was no 4th, and that voice had disappeared in the way things that are truly lost disappear. Some things, once lost, are lost forever. This story doesn't promise you that everything will return. It promises only that you can continue living. Josiah sat in the 3rd row. He was 7 years old now, and he had attended therapy regularly for an entire year, slowly healing from the grief that had silenced him. He still spoke very little, and no one at home considered that a problem. He had brought a sheet of paper and a pencil, as he always did. Halfway through the performance, when the 14 children went backstage to change costumes, and Mari stepped to the edge of the stage to retie the youngest child's shoelace, the boy rose from his seat. He held up his paper, and then he spoke, clearly, loudly enough for the entire row to hear, breaking his years of silence with the first complete sentence since his brother passed. "Mari, it's my turn." Mari straightened. She didn't turn around at once. She stood there at the edge of the stage with a shoelace in her hand, and something inside her chest had opened and could no longer close. Because of that voice. That voice belonged to the boy's older brother. For 3 years, she had tried to hear it inside her mind, and it had kept fading around the edges like a photograph left too long in the sun. And she had been terribly afraid of the day it would disappear completely. And now it had just sounded through a crowded theater, from the mouth of a 7-year-old child she had raised without ever knowing that she was preserving it. No one in the audience understood what had just happened. They saw only a boy calling to his sister-in-law, and a woman standing still for slightly too long at the edge of the stage. In the final row, against the wall, a man in a black wool coat sat alone. He always sat there. He never chose the front row, never rose to applaud, never told anyone that the school still existed because of a foundation named after a woman who had walked past that building all life with ever stepping inside. Mari turned and looked across the crowded room. He nodded once. She nodded back. That was all. There was nothing more, and nothing more was needed. Only 2 people who had once stood at the bottom of 2 different lives and climbed upward from there, and between them was a respect they had both paid far too dearly to possess. This isn't a story about a dance. It is a story about whom we see and whom we fail to see. The woman cleaning your floor may once have stood beneath stage lights. The man delivering your food may be raising a child 1 trip at a time. You don't know. You may never know. And that is exactly why you should be kind. Not because they might turn out to be important, but because they were already important before you ever had the chance to discover it. Respect doesn't cost you a single cent, but its absence can cost everything. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that every day you can continue listening to meaningful stories. How do you feel about the story of Moreva and Augustin? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear what is in the deepest part of your heart. May you and your family always enjoy good health, happiness, and peace throughout your journey. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.